Good morning, everyone. I'm just checking that, that you can hear me, that my microphone's working. Would you like me to just kick off straight away? Okay, great. Well, good morning and thank you very much for coming to this session. My name is Mike Appleby. I work at LionTrust, where I'm part of the investment team that essentially make the investment decisions and talk to the companies to improve how they're managed. And in this session, I'm really going to, my aim is to take you through an introduction to sustainable investing. It can be super confusing because there are all sorts of acronyms flying around, but I'm going to try and speak to you in English, in a simple way that sets the scene for the day, and hopefully you come out of this understanding more about sustainable investment than you do now. So it's probably worth pointing out what the main aims of sustainable investing are, and they are to outperform conventional benchmarks, so that's deliver decent competitive returns, by investing in sustainable companies. We're going to talk about what we mean by that a little bit later on. And also you're using engagement, your place at the table, to speak to companies on your investors' behalf to get them to get their act together and improve certain areas of the business that you feel that can be managed better. And that includes a lot of things that are sort of so-called extra financial. So it's not just governance and how much they pay themselves, but it's also about, depending on what the company is, human rights in their supply chain or emissions, etc. So going into these things that many investors care about. So to do this, there are hundreds of acronyms around, but there are basically only three things that you can do, three levers that you can push that make your fund any different to a conventional fund. And I'll quickly go through these, and the first one is to avoid certain controversial industries. And we're all familiar with arms, tobacco, and gambling. I would also include in there fossil fuels increasingly. So this is just saying we don't want to invest in companies that do this stuff. This has been around for a long time. It's also sometimes referred to as ethical investing, but I'm trying to stay away from labels. This is saying there's certain parts of the market, regardless of what we think the investment returns might be, we just don't want to get involved. So that's the first approach. The second approach is really trying to find, I've called this themes, sustainability themes. You're trying to find the companies that are providing the products and services that are going to solve some of the problems that we've got in trying to develop in a more sustainable way. And these are really interesting companies and a very compelling proposition. If you can make decent investment returns by investing in companies that are providing us with the stuff we need to get to a more sustainable world, that's really interesting. And I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about some examples of these themes later on. And then the final thing you can do is it's about what you say to companies. It's to do with engagement, and that is about influencing the companies to have more proactive strategies towards sustainability and to better manage their business. Now, where it gets confusing is that you can dial these three things up or down to different levels. So on the exclusions, you can have quite a lot of parts of the market that you exclude, or perhaps not that many. With the sustainable themes, you might have a very high hurdle over which you've got to get before a company is deemed to be associated with a positive theme, or it might be a very small amount of the business. And finally, that conversation you can have can vary in quality hugely. And I'm going to give some sort of protagonist example, but you can sit there in front of a big company every year and say, well, we want you to get better, but we don't want you to do it that fast. We want you to do it a little bit faster than you're doing now. And you're both sitting there and you both know that you're never going to divest from the company and you're just going through the sort of motions of business as usual. Contrast that with a conversation where you're really challenging a company and saying, look, I know that you're trying to decarbonize your business at 2 to 3% a year, but really the science is telling us that we need to decarbonize our absolute emissions sort of 5 to 7% a year. So we really want you to go away and think about this and come up with a strategy that means that you're going to be able to succeed in the ultra-low carbon world we need. And so that's why people, I think, can get a bit confused about to what extent a fund is dialing up these various bits. So let's think about change, and let's think about some positive news stories. Really hard to find at the moment, I know. But if you step back and you think over a longer time frame, there have been some incredible improvements to our economy. If you look at the chart on the far left, this shows an incredibly sad statistic, which is child mortality, defined as children that do not live to see their 5th birthday. And what's happened is that these child mortality rates have plummeted from a shocking 1 in 5 children not making it to their 5th birthday, say 100, 150 years ago, to a fraction of a percent now. Now, this is a massive improvement. We don't read about this very much, but really positive things going on in reducing child mortality. And that's globally. It's not just here. So a real positive. Let's look at the second graph. This is the one in the middle. This is in the UK, and this is the number of people that are killed on our roads as a result of road traffic accidents. And this has fallen massively. And that's because we've introduced seat belts, brakes have got better, signage has got better, we've all had to pass tests that are increasingly stringent, etc. This is despite, so there's been a 75% decrease in the number of people killed each year on the roads in my lifetime since I started driving. And that's despite the fact that a quarter more miles are driven every year as well. So massive improvements in road safety. And then finally, on the right, this looks at air pollution in cities in the UK. And it shows the incidence of PM10. This is particulate matter that's 10 microns wide. You can't see it. It's particulate dust. It's particularly nasty stuff. It's bad for your health. It's particularly bad for development in children. But you can see that, again, since 1992, when I left university, that the incidence of very high periods of this PM10 in our cities in the UK has fallen by nearly 90%. So there's been a massive improvement in our local air quality in the UK, although you won't really read that anywhere. Now, that's not to say that all of these things can't get better. But what I'm trying to get at here is that these are the positive trends that have been happening over the last 30 years. And I'm really talking about that middle section to do with sustainability themes, those positive long-term growth areas to find pockets in the economy. And this is what we're trying to look for the next 30 years. We're trying to find the companies that are going to help deliver that. But let's just think about what role have companies played in that. How does this change happen? Does it just happen randomly, or is there something going on behind it? And essentially it starts with science and our understanding. As we learnt that high lead levels in urban areas as a result of leaded fuel was affecting the development of children, people wanted something done about it, and most governments want to get re-elected. And so they respond to society's needs. And then critically, it's the businesses that take the best available technology, innovate, scale it up, and distribute it out to everyone so that we can have these improvements. So let's think about these sustainability themes. I've put them in 3 buckets here. The first one is really to do with resource efficiency. The second one's to do with our health. And the last one's really to do with the resilience of the systems we all rely on to get stuff done. And it relates to safety as well. So let's start with resource efficiency and talk about improving the efficiency of energy use. I'm going to go into this in a bit more detail later, but essentially the way we use energy and resources at the moment is not optimal. There are much smarter ways to use it, and we're looking for companies whose products and services are allowing us to be much smarter about the way we use finite resources. In the second area, let's think about improved health. I've pulled one out here called Enabling Healthier Lifestyles. So there is a global obesity problem, and a lot of that is to do with eating very high calorific food and not doing enough exercise. And we look for companies that are either able to reformulate foods that make them taste just as nice but have a lot lower calories and salt in them, companies like Kerry Group, etc. By the way, please don't go and buy any company that I mentioned today. It's just an example, and I'm not giving you investment advice. That's to keep my compliance lot true, and that is true. So that's one area. And the other one is increasing the number of people that can go and take exercise. So we've got these incredible low-cost gyms that have come out in the last 5 years or so. I'm talking about companies like Gym Group. Apparently, as you can tell, I have no idea what the inside of a gym might look like, but apparently you can enjoy going to the gym for something like 20 quid a month with the likes of Gym Group, and this compares to more like 50 or 60 quid for the higher end gyms. And this is enabling a huge number of people that weren't able to go to gyms before to go and experience that improvement that you get as a result of doing that extra exercise. And of course, we've seen a lot with what happened with COVID, and there are companies that are able to speed up drug trials by using artificial intelligence and working out the right populations, and you're able to make huge improvements in how quickly you can get a drug approved or find out whether it works or not. And there are companies like IQVIA in the US that have done this. So lots of interesting areas there. And then finally, let's look at this resilience aspect. I guess the easiest one is, as more and more of our lives go online, it's critical that information is kept safe, and cybersecurity is an area which is seeing continued growth. And if you talk to chief technology officers, which we do, it's an area they're not dialing back on their spend, because as they say, you only know if you've spent enough on cybersecurity when it's too late. And that translates, it depends where you are and what part of the market, but 5 to 8% growth per year over the next decade or so of people spending money to keep our data safe within their businesses. So there are a couple of bits to come away from here. So the first thing is, there are lots of different themes going on. It's not just about environmental technology and renewables, although they're critical. There are lots of other areas that you can get exposure to, and these go right the way across the economy, and that enables us with multi-themed approach, trying to gain exposure to these companies that are providing the services that we need more of to develop in a more sustainable way. That helps us build diversified portfolios. We happen to have 20 themes, but lots of people have others as well. So let's talk about climate change. And essentially, humans are emitting huge amounts of carbon as a result of our activity, and that's principally down to the burning of fossil fuels. About 80% of it is that. And we have this idea of the global average temperature rise as compared to pre-industrial levels. And we have something called the Paris Agreement, which is where we internationally agreed to try and keep the global average temperature rise down to less than 2 degrees, or ideally 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, I know this can sound a bit confusing, but to give you an idea of what a 3 to 4 degree centigrade change in global average temperatures is a really, really big deal, and is certainly enough to take the globe in or out of an ice age, a couple of degrees. So every 1/10 of a degree is really critical here. And this is something done by Climate Action Tracker, where they're saying that essentially the world has warmed by about 1 degree. It's actually a little bit higher than that now. And if you were to take all of the current policies and implement them, which is critical, we would overshoot that 2-degree mark that's the target by anywhere between 3.5 to 4.5 degrees centigrade. So we're definitely not on track to, even with the most optimistic policies out there that are expected to come, we're nowhere close to trying to keep the global average temperature rise below 2 degrees. And this is often thought as an eco-warrior kind of thing, but it's a social issue as well. And it's interesting that Lancet yesterday came out with a piece that highlights that there are huge social impacts as a result of climate change, and that essentially the amount of money that we're going to lose as a result of climate change is way higher than the amount of money we need to spend to try and mitigate and reduce our emissions. So another thing to take away from this is there are going to be globally more stringent regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as a result of that, there are going to be some winners and there are going to be some losers. So let's quickly look at the losers first. So this chart here shows between 2005 and 2020 the amount of electricity generated in the US that comes from nuclear, which is in blue, it's been pretty steady, and what comes from coal, which is the orange one at the top. And I don't know if any of you remember Donald Trump, but he was pro-coal and anti-renewables, and yet in his tenure we saw a huge reduction in the amount of electricity in the US that comes from coal-fired plants. And you can see that coal-fired electricity generation fell by over 60% during this period. And that was really because coal could not compete with lower carbon alternatives economically, principally natural gas, but also renewables. And the winners, renewables, are doing really well. When I first started doing this in 2004, renewables were ridiculously expensive, required huge subsidies, and it felt quite tough to work out how we were going to get them to enough scale. As a result of them scaling up, they are now the cheapest form of new electricity generation pretty much everywhere on the planet. For example, in the US, there is no cheaper way to generate electrons than with solar. And as a result, we're seeing huge increases in the amount of renewables that get installed. And we reckon that's going to grow anywhere between 5 to 7% every year for the next 20 years. So this is an area of structural growth. And even if you don't invest in renewables, do not bet against them, because you're really going to struggle to be economic with them. So I mentioned there are some winners and losers. We've talked about renewable energy. Energy efficiency is a big deal. I'm going to go and talk about some examples about that in a minute. There is going to be disruption in transport. If you think about the UK, our biggest source of emissions is transport, and there will be substitution of the internal combustion engine and hopefully a lot more public transport being used as well to reduce congestion, to reduce emissions, and also improve safety on our roads. And then finally, there are some industries where there are lower carbon alternatives that are simply not going to make it. And I think it's very important to realize that all this chat about climate change is going to have a material impact on how much money different businesses are going to be able to generate in an ultra-low carbon world, or a world that's moving towards that. So this is particularly prescient now if you think about what's happened with the current energy crisis, with natural gas prices going through the roof, being sort of 3 to 5 times more expensive than they've been historically, and electricity prices following suit as well. If we think about resource efficiency and energy efficiency, this has become even more critical now. And if you think about what energy efficiency is about reducing the amount of energy we waste, which means you reduce your energy bill, and it also means in the process that you reduce emissions. And the International Energy Association, who aren't particularly proactive, even they have estimated that of the emissions we need to reduce, 40% can come from energy efficiency alone. So this is just about using energy more efficiently, and we've seen smart lighting, LED lighting, you get the same amount of light, sort of 80% less energy to do that. Building insulation, the payback period for the amount of time it would take for you to recoup the money you spent on that insulation has come down to a matter of months now in some areas. And also within industrial processes, if you can use waste streams or you can use waste heat within your process and capture that, there are lots of opportunities to make things much more efficient and to reduce the amount of energy that we need to use in the first place. So one of the areas is to do with recycling metals, and if you take an aluminium drinks can, for example, that aluminium can be made of one of two ways. It can either come from primary ore, where you mine, in this case the bauxite, heat it up, turn it into aluminium, finish it into your can, or it can come from scrap aluminium that gets melted down and gets made into exactly the same can. And the difference in terms of the amount of energy used is the can that's made from the recycled aluminium uses 74% less energy than from primary mined aluminium. And these are the kind of quantums that we're looking for. And so that's an area where huge opportunity is to reduce our emissions and the energy intensity. And if we can find companies that are helping remove valuable bits of waste from the waste stream and recycle it, or are involved in that recycling loop, they're likely to experience long-term demand for their services as we shift to try and use as much recycled materials, particularly in metals, as we can. Okay, so we've talked a lot about themes and about sustainability, but if you're in sustainable investment, unfortunately, we can't just go and pick lots of lovely companies that do really cool stuff that make us, our environment and our society better. We've got to pick companies that do that, but that are also likely to deliver decent investment returns. Our clients don't really want to hear about how we lost a huge amount of money in something, but it's fine because we're trying to save the planet. So we've talked about themes this morning quite a lot. The second area that's important is the quality of the management team and whether they're really managing the important bits that are relevant to their business proactively and in a forward-thinking way. So those are the two sustainability inputs, if you like, but also there's some other stuff. Some people find it the boring stuff, but I'm afraid it is important as well. I've called it business fundamentals. Is this business able to make decent investment returns? Is it doing something that's quite difficult to replicate and therefore it's likely to continue to make decent investment returns? And then finally, putting all of that together, what assumptions have we got to make about what this company might be worth in 5 years' time? Does it look like it's going to be worth a lot more in 5 years' time, or does it look like that in fact a lot of this good news is perhaps in the price? And I'm not saying it's overvalued, but it's hard to see it going up in terms of value per share a lot more than here. And when you have all four of those aspects aligned, that's what we would define as being a sustainable investment. I'm sorry, I don't know what's happened there, but it's very large anyway, at least you can see that. So let's, how are we doing for time? Okay, I'm just going to talk quickly about additional reporting. Some of that was mentioned this morning. You need to be super transparent. Totally agree. You need to see all of the companies the fund's invested in, not just the top 10, and an explanation of why it deserves a place in a sustainable fund. And we've talked about themes. and you can have, happens to be one of our funds, but it shows what proportion of the fund is invested in companies that are associated with those positive themes, and the three different buckets is about a third each, so about a third in resource efficiency, a third in that improving health, and a third in resilience, demonstrating that that is diversified across all of these different themes that are here on the right. If you like using the language of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, those themes can be mapped to the underlying Sustainable Development Goals. We want to hit these goals by 2030, and you can map those through to the 190 or so underlying key performance indicators that are associated with this, if you like. And also there's a lot more interest in carbon footprinting, and this shows that the stocks in this particular fund, they emit 89% less CO2 from their direct operations as compared to the market as a whole. Just over a quarter of the funds invested in companies that have technologies which directly cut emissions for the people that use them. And finally, there are no companies that we're invested in that are extracting or producing fossil fuels. And so this is something that can help you compare. Also, if you go back to what I was talking about before, if we're going to get anywhere close to 2 degrees warming, and the latest conference of parties is in Egypt, COP27, which is coming up, to try and make further progress and agreements on reducing emissions internationally, we're going to see more regulation. And let's just imagine we woke up tomorrow morning and there was a global price on a ton of carbon if it came out of your business. And what would happen is the companies would try and pass that cost on to their customers. If their customers could afford that or were willing to, that company would remain as profitable as it was yesterday. If, however, the customers are unable to take on that cost or unwilling, that carbon cost would be borne by the business, and therefore they would make less money. And what this is showing is that in the event of a price of carbon coming in, these companies would have 89% less carbon costs to pass on to their customers than the market as a whole. And that would make a very meaningful difference to how resilient their margins would be and how they would be able to continue to make the kind of investment returns even as a result of a huge impact such as a global carbon price. I'm just quickly going to spend a couple of minutes on engagement, and then hopefully we've got time for some questions. So I think it's important with engagement that you have some long-term priority, proactive things that you're trying to do with companies over a number of years. These are some examples to do with the climate crisis and biodiversity, but also to do with improving disclosures about how companies manage their staff and their interaction on the social side, as well as diversity within boards and within companies as well. And then this, I wouldn't bother with the detail here, but this shows what we did in 2022 and what types of issues we were talking to companies about. And it just shows that about 2/3 of our time we were talking about these long-term proactive engagement activities, and about 1/3 of the time reacting to stuff that was going on. And I think it's important to have a plan in your engagement so that you can know where you're heading and try and affect positive change. Important information. There are lots of risks, and nothing I've said should be construed as an investment recommendation. We've got a few minutes left. I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Yes, I think there's a microphone somewhere, but is there a mic? No. Why don't you have a go at just... yeah.
I run a AI startup listed equities. My question with regards to your presentation and the breakdown of the assets is what is your confidence level when you, for instance, when you talk about carbon reduction, and there's quite precise measures given, quite precise numbers given there. Going back to the previous panel discussions and the questions about greenwashing or impact washing and so on, do you have a margin of error there that takes that into account, or how do you deal with that question in being able to have those precise metrics? That would be very interesting,
sure.
I think, to answer.
Okay,
Thank you.
so this gentleman has an interesting company that uses artificial intelligence to help get impact measures, and his question essentially was, how can we be so sure of some very specific numbers that we've given here? And that's a very good question. So there are a few numbers that I've mentioned. I'll just go through them. So the last thing I talked about was that carbon footprinting, and that is simply looking at, as at the end of 2021, what were the carbon emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2, for the companies in the portfolio versus the market. And I think while there used to be quite large margins of error required for that because not everyone disclosed that, I think the data coverage on that is well above sort of 96, 97%. And I think that number, it might not be 89, but it might be plus or minus 2 or 3%. So I think in terms of that, that's quite a fairly accurate thing. In terms of the themes, what proportion of the fund is associated. So for us, we require a company to have at least a quarter of its business is associated with a theme. And ideally, we want over half of the business measured either by a proportion of sales or ideally by a proportion of their profit to be associated with that theme. And if you look at the average exposure to themes in that fund is around 85%. So there's actually a very high proportion of the businesses that are invested in are exposed to those themes. So, but I think where things get a little bit harder are about what companies are saying they're going to do. So let's talk about the Science-Based Target Initiative, getting companies to commit to, I omitted to say, we need to halve absolute emissions every 10 years. Halve them. So this isn't about 1 or 2%. It's a huge, huge amount. And I have some skepticism about, I think that committing to decarbonize in line with the science at 5 to 7% a year is a good thing. I'm not saying that's not a bad thing. But you do get things like temperature alignment assessments for a portfolio, and I think some of those are a little bit misleading because they look at future intended decarbonisation targets, but they don't mention how much carbon they've got today. Clearly, if you're a company that hardly emits any carbon, you're going to find it a lot easier to decarbonise than, say, a company that emits more than the UK, and there are some, by the way. So I think in terms of what we really want to see is you want to look at the underlying data. It's great that someone's committed to reduce carbon emissions, but you want to look at it every year and go, well, how are you doing? And also you want to talk to them and think, where are your emissions coming from broadly? And is your strategy realistic? Do we think you're going to be able to make it? And unfortunately, that's not really captured in a lot of these single metrics that people look at. And of course, carbon footprinting has its own limitations as well. But I think by looking at 3 or 4 different metrics, it can help give you a much more meaningful picture of really what's going on than just concentrating on one metric. Hopefully that answers partly your question. We've got a couple more minutes if anyone's got any other questions. The gentleman at the front. I think. No. Oh no, you didn't. Okay, sorry. I didn't mean to throw you a hospital pass there or anything. I don't want to intimidate the audience. Well, listen, if there aren't any more questions, thank you very much. I really appreciate you spending time and taking the time to come to this event. I hope it's going to be really useful for you. Don't worry, there is a lot more detail coming. This was just an introduction, and I think I might be seeing you a bit later on if you're around for the climate crisis and what investors can do about that. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks.